Hello everybody, CVH here, and today we're going to be talking about the Forgotten Hero Collection, the most recent expansion, mini expansion in The Elder Scrolls Legends. I'm sure you guys already know, but you can purchase this expansion now for $10 or 1,500 gold in the store, whether or not you want to spend money or in-game gold. It is available now. Official release date is today on Thursday, the 1st of February, although it was in the client yesterday. So I figured, as I usually do, I'll go through all 12 cards the expansion has given us, give my first impressions in my initial review. Full disclosure, again, we've only had this expansion for about 24 hours now, so I've only been able to play test with a couple of these cards. So this will be closer to my first impression videos than a full set review, but I do like to get my opinions out there early while the cards are fresh and while I'm first thinking about them. So I'm going to focus a little bit less on the overall power level of the cards. I don't want to say things that are set in stone, because I do think this set has a few cards that could surprise us one way or the other, but I would like to go through and talk about them and potential strategic implications. But let's get started with the first of the 12 cards we're going to be talking about today, with the Strength card from the Forgotten Hero Collection, Cradlecrushed Giant. And again, each attribute is given one additional card by this mini expansion, and then the rest of the cards will all be neutral. So Cradlecrushed Giant is the Strength card. 6 magic is 6/4 with summon, deal 2 damage to all other creatures in this lane. Basically a gigantic version of Skaven Pyromancer, which is a 3-cost 2/3 that deals 1 damage to all other creatures in its lane on summon. Cradlecrushed Giant's dealing a little bit more damage. It's still only affecting the same lane. Okay enough stats for a 6-cost that is aggressively statted, not too durable, kind of similar to Belligerent Giant, which is a 7 magic, a 7/4. This creature will be dying to Lightning Bolt, but the effect is where this card gets a lot of additional value. I think this card could fit in pretty well in a slower mid-range or control-oriented decks like Warrior, maybe Battle Mage. I've seen a lot of people say they want to try this out, maybe in addition to Ice Storm in Merrick Battle Mage, a card with aggressive implications and also defensive implications that can even proc your own cards like Breton Conjure. So on the surface, this is one of the cards I think I like the most out of all of them in the expansion. There are decks already in existence that could make use of this card, I think, that are good, like Merrick Battle Mage, and it could even shed some new light on some of those slower decks like Control Warrior that don't see a lot of play now, but are just looking for good class-specific control tools, and Cradlecrushed Giant could fit the bill. Next up, we have Doppelganger. I actually was able to reveal this card live on stream a couple days ago. All the reveals happened really fast, and then the set just seemed to be out already, so I didn't have the time to do a specific video for any of the reveals or this card that I was able to reveal live on stream. And in fact, I have to bring up the premium version of this card. It just looks too good. Way too good to ignore. One of the wackier cards in the expansion. I know it's a pretty small expansion, but this card is a really interesting effect. I compared it a lot to Faceless Manipulator from Hearthstone when I was doing the card reveal. It doesn't operate the same way, though. If you come from that game, transformation effects do work differently in Legends from Hearthstone and maybe even other games. So when you're summoning and you're transforming Doppelganger into a copy of another friendly creature, you will be able to get that summon effect from the creature you're copying. If you copy a Manticore with Doppelganger, you will be able to destroy something in the same lane. Also, Doppelganger doesn't carry over any damage that was on the original creature, any stat modifications on the original creature, any items that were on the original creature do not carry over to the Doppelganger. So in some way it limits the amount of combo potential you can have by buffing a giant creature and then making another giant buffed creature, but of course you also don't retain the damage and you get to activate summon effects. I've only been able to test this card a little bit in a Control Mage shell. It was actually a Singleton Control Mage, for full disclosure there. But Doppelganger was very interesting. Only time will tell if it sees long-term play. I do think this is probably a card for those slower decks, maybe slower mid-range or even control decks. I think I do like its implications mostly in control. You get to copy those high-value effects like Marok, Manticore, Parthenax. All seem like fantastic targets. I don't think it's possible that a card like this remains strictly unplayable, so I do think it'll see long-term play somewhere. We'll just have to find the best decks for it in the coming weeks. Next up is the Willpower card, Cast into Time, a 5 magicka action with banish a creature and all creatures from your opponent's deck with the same name. A lot of people were worried about this card when it was first revealed as a strictly better piercing javelin from your hand, but of course the downside compared to javelin is that all-important prophecy tag on the javelin. Cast into Time is really never going to cost 0. Well, I mean, I guess it could cost 0 if you draw it with Nokreen, but that's definitely a fringe case, and Piercing Javelin being that crazy tempo swing from a rune is basically a lot of the reason you see the card in so many decks. Cast into Time does not have that, but it is a very specific kind of piercing javelin-esque effect that in certain metas and certain matchups could be way better. For example, if you're using this on a card like Paarthurnax, they cannot Soul Tear it. If you're using it on a card like Giant Bat, they can't buff the other copy, they can't play other copies, they can't buff them all from the discard pile. You're basically getting rid of a threat entirely when you're playing this card. Not even just that one threat like a Paarthurnax, but all instances of that threat. Imagine if they shuffled Paarthurnax into their deck with Galen, 3 copies of that, then you're casting to time the first Paarthurnax, and they're all gone. Pretty nice. It doesn't affect the hand, though. There was at least one depressing instance for me already where I was up against a warrior deck. I played Cast into Time on Sower of Revenge. I was feeling really good about it, too. I had saved the Cast into Time specifically for the Sower of Revenge. And then over the next 2 turns, my opponent played 2 more Sower of Revenge anyway because he had the other 2 copies in his hand already, which was incredibly disappointing. Wasn't the greatest first impression for Cast into Time to give me. I think this card could definitely fit into some control decks. Definitely not a card for the aggressive decks, in my opinion at least. But in the control decks, I think it'll just depend on how the meta shapes up. If you're seeing a lot of control mirror matches and a lot of discard pile interactions like Soul Tear or a lot of shuffling mechanics like Galen, this card could be perfect. If the meta's more aggressive and you need to tool your deck to deal with those more aggressive decks, then Cast into Time might not make the cut, but definitely a really solid tech choice. Sly Marshblade is the agility card from the Forgotten Hero collection, a simple 2-cost 3/2 with Last Gasp, draw a card if you have 7 or more max magicka. So hooray, more cards for Ram Scout because we all love that deck. But in all honesty, I was thinking about it, I'm not sure if this really makes the cut in Ram Scout. You already have Thieves Guild Recruit, and how many cards can you really dedicate to the value slot when you're playing a 2 magic card? Because I like Thieves Guild Recruit and then maybe a defensive option like Fighters Guild Recruit or Murkwater Witch, and space is limited because you typically want to play the Shout package in that kind of deck. So I really don't know if I have room for this. It does fight for the board kind of decently early, but you're really not getting much value from it until the late game, at which point this card having better stats than Thieves Guild Recruit doesn't really matter as much as the fact that you're not drawing the card immediately. So it's kind of an awkward card in that way. It's a card with stats that help you in the early game, but you'd rather get the value late. So I guess you could say it fights for the board early, and if you happen to draw it late, it's not completely dead. But how much better is it really than Thieves Guild Recruit? I'm not even sure after Thieves Guild Recruit's nerf. I really like this card in Arena, though, because a card that's that versatile in Arena is kind of exactly where you want to be. You definitely need to have enough 2-drops in versus Arena to compete on the board, or even solo Arena, so you don't lose the board entirely against the AI. You need cards like this that are just simple 2 magicka 3/2s. I've drafted tons of Hailstorm footpads, and in the late game, if you draw those 2-drops, it can be kind of disappointing. While the Marshblade doesn't draw you another card immediately, sort of making up for the dead draw, it will get that value back and allow you to cycle further in your deck. So honestly, I can unironically say I do think this is a very arena playable card. It could make the cut in a constructed deck here or there. I really don't think so, but I am very excited for this card in Arena, and I plan to take it a lot. Next up is the Endurance card, Bleak Coast Troll, and what can be said about this card that hasn't already been said? This card is just kind of monstrous on turn 4. 4 magic of 5/5, already definitely passing the vanilla test there, similar to Black Dragon, and way better than Stonetooth Scrapper already, besides the Orc synergy that this card does not have, with Slay +1/+1. So, of course, bonus effect whenever it destroys a creature on your turn. Whether you're trading, whether you're going face, this card just kind of gets there in a major way and is pretty hard to kill for a 4-drop. It's not getting lightning bolted, and very few 4-cost creatures, if any, are going to be trading into it without help of an action. Another battle trick like an item. Bleak Coast Troll, if you can play it on a clear board or in a clear lane, it's just kind of going to take over that lane. Requires an Edict of Azure or a Piercing Javelin, a rather inefficient answer from control decks, and in those mid-range battles when you're fighting for the board, few things do it as well as the Troll. I don't think this really breaks the game. A lot of people are really worried about this card's power level, but I think that just means it's constructed playable, and I'm excited to see cards in expansions like this that you see and you just kind of know they're going to see play in constructed. Mid-range Sorcerer really competes for that 4-cost slot well against Royal Sage, Mystic Dragon, and Corrupted Shade. In mid-range Scout, the options are definitely limited. They don't have Royal Sage or Mystic Dragon. You're really just competing with Corrupted Shade and Preserver of the Root, which doesn't get value from stats until later. So I definitely think, especially in the non-sorcerer mid-range decks, and potentially in Spellsword as well, although there are a lot of really good 4-cost willpower creatures like Hive Defender, Cloud Rest Illusionist, and the Black Dragon already. Bleak Coast Troll, though, I definitely expected to see long-term play in mid-rangey purple decks. Just a fantastic, simple, aggressive card. Shouldn't even need to say how good it's going to be in Arena. Definitely plan on seeing your fair share of trolls in Arena after this expansion. But yeah, excited for this card. Very simple, very, well, not even really elegant. It just sort of gets played and starts beating up your opponent. But what can you do? Then we move on to the last 7 cards, which are all in neutral. And I think we'll just be talking about the 3 unique legendaries in the expansion first, because they all sort of have the same plan, they all fit into the same style of deck, and there are interesting talking points around all 3 of them. So of course that style of deck is a singleton deck, a Highlander deck, which has no duplicate cards, just one of every single card that you're including, 50 different cards. Sounds like a lot, because it is. But we have Set's Masterwork, which is a 3 Magicka support, ongoing. If you started the game with no duplicate cards in your deck, your cards cost 1 less. Then we have Mordecai the Deathless, 5 cost 5/5. Summon, again, if you started the game with no duplicates, you gain 5 health and restore a rune. So we have another one of those rune restoration effects, similar to the Mechanical Heart from the last expansion, which was the first rune restoration effect we've seen. And Siege of Stros M'Kai, which is if you started the game with no duplicate cards in your deck, you play a random creature, item, support, and action from your deck. So basically every card type is just coming to the board, does have some level of variance, and it has a hefty cost of 10. This is a crazy value-oriented late game control card to just finish the game and bury your opponent under the card advantage and potential options, even though it does have that level of variance, which neither of the other 2 cards I mentioned have. So between the Masterwork, Mordecai, and the Siege, they're trying to push that archetype of simply playing 50 different cards in your deck. And it's impossible to talk about this without mentioning decks like Reno Lock and Rizaka's Priest in Hearthstone, which successfully have made those decks a part of those metas. Honestly, those kind of decks kind of annoy the hell out of me, just as a Spike who likes to try to optimize decks and optimize plays. The idea of it being optimal to do something suboptimal in the deck building process just sort of doesn't appeal to me, and I didn't really want them to be competitive in Hearthstone. Reno pushing them to the forefront, I wasn't a huge fan of that, but I do understand their appeal, right? 50 different cards means you have a lot of different options, a lot of different, like the games just feel super specific. You don't really have the same styles of games, you don't curve out with the same cards, you draw different cards every game and get into different situations, and you get to play cards that would normally make the cut in optimal construct deck because you're looking to try to find the redundancy. I don't have my 3 Daggerfall Mages or my 3 Lightning Bolts. What do I play that gets the job done in a different way? And that can create all kinds of different situations. But you are, at the end of the day, making your deck suboptimal as far as draw consistency in order to play 3 cards in this case, which should again offer more powerful options when you get to play them, which has its own problem because of course the power level of those decks when they're in a game is heavily reliant on whether or not you draw these cards when you need to. Granted, it isn't that hard to draw at least one of them in a game. In Reno Lock, in Hearthstone, there was 1 card that cared about no duplicates out of 30. In Rizaka's Priest, there are 2 out of 30. Now we have 3 out of a 50 card deck, even though 1 is incredibly expensive at a 10 cost. Mordecai and Set's Masterwork do put in a lot of work, and I've tested a little bit of the singleton decks. I didn't want to go into this review for these cards in particular completely blind. I will say these cards feel very powerful. All 3 of them. When you can play Masterwork early, the rest of your game becomes so much easier. Mordecai against aggressive decks, especially if you can duplicate this card's effect with a card like Dark Rebirth or Doppelganger, whatever you have. It's a very powerful effect. Rune Restoration is not something to scoff at, and it's a 5 cost 5/5, which is pretty substantial on the board like Iron. And Siege, what can I say? If you're in the late game and you need some way to get far ahead of your opponent, it does get the job done. The variance is sort of unavoidable because you will be playing more than one of each of those card types in your 50 card singleton deck, and you can't really be too sure what you're pulling unless you run out of all of them except for 1 copy left. But I haven't really been too disappointed. If you need a lot of value, the card gives you a lot of value, and the other 2 cards are just pretty good overall. I do want to say, though, for the record, that in my admittedly limited play testing with the Singleton Mage and a little bit of Singleton Sorcerer so far, at no point did the deck as a functioning whole feel as powerful as simply a regular control mage or even a control sorcerer probably would have. These cards are a lot of fun, they feel good to play, I'm sure they appeal to a lot of players out there, and I encourage you to experiment with the deck if you want, but to me it reminds me of something like Altar of Despair Assassin, which is a fun deck to build. You get to play a lot of cool cards, have a lot of interesting games with fun interactions, it's skill testing, it's just, the games do tend to take a while, and you get to put yourself in crazy situations and play really powerful cards potentially, but the deck as itself, I don't think in general the consistency is really there as you would probably expect to make this a tier 1 strategy. So if you want to experiment with these cards, I recommend it. They're a lot of fun, but I wouldn't necessarily worry that these cards are going to warp the meta into some singleton fiesta. As far as design goes, though, I would like to touch on this because a lot of people seem to be upset that they're dedicating all 3 unique legendary slots to this deck. I don't really mind it. I think it's a fun deck. I think it appeals to a lot of players out there, and I think there are enough cards in the rest of the expansion that appeal to other decks and other types of players that I don't mind these 3 unique legendaries having this sort of flavor. Next, we have Namira Shrine, a 4-cost support, ongoing. At the end of your turn, if you've played 3 cards this turn, draw a card. Haven't seen this card yet. I imagine there are probably combo decks out there that will want it if they don't want it already. My mind immediately goes to a deck like Swindler's Market, maybe Assassin or Swindler's Market Archer, especially in the Archer to me because you can play Raiding Party and the 2 Nord Firebrands immediately, and boom, there are your 3 cards because your first card generated 2 more free cards. So it doesn't seem too hard to activate in that style of deck. I don't really think it'll fit outside of combo decks that typically play a lot of these things. You can maybe play it in like the Stealer Secrets, OTK. None of these decks are really too played right now, but I imagine that if they do see more play, Namira Shrine could easily be a part of them. Next is Voice of Balance. A lot of people are getting on this card for potentially being a little too good. I don't know if I'm quite there yet. When I first saw it, I thought it might be a little too bad because you have to build your deck kind of around it. But let's read the card. 4 cost, 4/4, summon +4/+4, and guard if you have an action, item, and support in your discard pile or in play. So again, you need a lot of card types to get this card going. But of course, a lot of decks are already going to be playing a lot of these. The issue is playing enough of them in your deck to where you can consistently get Voice of Balance on the board with the buff, preferably earlier than later, because if you play it late in the game, it's kind of just like a Swamp Leviathan if you're floating Magicka anyway, assuming you're playing this in a more aggressive deck, which would probably want a 4-cost 8/8 more than a slow deck would, with no additional effect. But there are some cards that make this a lot easier, such as Corsairship, which is a support that gives you an item immediately. So as long as you have support, as long as you have the Corsairship in play, all you need at that point is to have played an action at any point during the game and you're good to go. Same with Skyforge, because it is a support that gives you Steel Daggers. So I've already seen a couple players experiment at High Legend with this in Battle Mage and Sorcerer, and I think the results have been pretty positive from what I understand. I was a little not sold on this card at first, and you know, at the end of the day, if you do get this card off, it's just a big dumb threat that's not really going to be, you know, it's not going to impact the board in other ways. You can't really use this card defensively, but if you're looking for a card that's just gigantic on board, Bleak Coast Troll can take a backseat. If you're able to set this card up, it could easily be the biggest thing on board in the early to mid game. You will be suffering somewhat of a tempo loss if you play a card like Skyforge on 3 or Corsairship on 4, but that could very well turn out to be worth it. I have to test this card for myself. I do expect this card to see play though, and it'll be interesting to find the balance around building your deck so you can proc this card consistently and also accomplish your game plan normally. Wolfrics Uprising is next, the 6 Magicka action with trigger the friendly summon of each friendly creature. All those summon abilities are going to be going off immediately as if you played Necrom Mastermind on Last Gasps. This basically serves as the Necrom Mastermind of summon effects. And there are a lot more powerful summon effects and just a lot more summon effects in general in the game than Last Gasp effects. I only really see this card being, I don't know, I would like to say a control card because of all the high value summon effects. While I think this effect is really cool, I just don't know if the cost is going to make it too playable. You can't really play it in something more aggressive. I think most of those creatures don't have the highest of impact of summon effects besides, like, you know, Wardcrafter, Shrieking Harpy. On a Bone Colossus, it could be very cool to get more skeletons, but when you don't have a crazy good setup for it, this card is just dead in your hand. And that means a control deck could potentially get away with it because you can afford to have a couple dead cards in your hand and you can afford to play that long game until you can play this for a lot of value. I just don't know. It seems like a very specific effect. I love Necrom Mastermind too, and that card has a 5/4 body attached to it, and it still doesn't really make the cut in Constructed, so I don't really think we'll be seeing too much of Wolfrics Uprising, honestly, but I love the effect, I love the flavor, and I hope we see more cards that can help trigger other friendly summon abilities in the future. Doppelganger does what this card wants to do, I think, pretty much perfectly. It's a 5-cost card that's going to give you stats and duplicate the summon effect of something on the board already. Wolfrics Uprising can trigger way more summon effects, but doesn't really have any versatility outside of that. I will say, though, this is one of the cards that I hope surprises me. And finally, we come to Tullius' Conscription, the last card to talk about today, an 11 Magicka neutral action that says summon one of each creature from your deck that costs 2 or less. You'd think it would be kind of a larger effect for this absurdly high costed action, but the effect itself could be huge in the right circumstance. I don't really think there's a deck right now that plays enough 2-cost creatures naturally that would really get value out of this. The decks that tend to play the most 2-cost creatures, or 2-cost or less creatures I suppose, tend to be aggressive decks, and while this effect could bring out a lot of those creatures to the board, I don't think it makes up for the fact that you're playing an 11-cost action in a deck that almost definitely does not want to go until turn 11. That having been said, there's at least one card already in existence for slower decks that could make this quite the powerful play, and that card is Journey to Sovngarde, which buffs everything in your discard pile by +5/+5, shuffles them all into your deck, and makes them cost 5 less. So the vast majority of things you'll be shuffling in are probably going to be able to be hit by TES' conscription, and it will probably fill the board immediately with absolutely massive creatures in a single card. So you don't even have to wait with the Journey value. Usually when you play Journey and you start drawing those buffed creatures, it can be game over. This just puts the nail in the coffin for your opponent. You're just going to get about 7 or 8 gigantic creatures immediately, and your opponent's going to have to deal with all of them or lose the game on the spot. Now, I know I sort of hyped that situation up, but I'm not sure if that really allows this card to make the cut in Constructed. You are basically playing a card that has no value until the Journey, if you're playing it in a regular Control Mage deck, which might have Shrieking Harpy and that's it, or Shrieking Harpy and Wardcraft, or maybe Broom of Profiteer. You're still really not looking to play the TES' conscription until the Journey to Sovngarde goes off. Is it worth it just for that specific scenario? Does it make it that much better? Is it worth having a potentially dead card in your hand for the first 10 turns and then still pretty bad until the Journey and other matchups? I'm not totally sure, but this card could be hilarious after a Journey, and of course very powerful after Journey as well. So potentially we see more cards in the future that could synergize with the TES conscription. Definitely a card to keep in mind. It's an effect that doesn't look too threatening, but could definitely be that way after a certain other card has been played. So that's it for me. Those are the 12 cards from the Forgotten Hero collection. Like I said, available now in the store for I think $9.99 US or 1,500 gold. I recommend it. I think it's a great expansion. I might do an overall review on it later once we get more of a handle on where the power level of each of these cards sits. But hopefully you guys enjoyed my first impressions, so to speak. And as always, if you did, feel free to leave a like, stay subscribed for more Legends content, follow my stream in the description, and I'll see you next time.